It's my pleasure to welcome you here today to this webinar on ecosystem functions and wetland restoration. And specifically, we'll be focusing on peatland restoration today, as these make up over 90% of the wetlands that we have in Canada and are particularly important in the boreal and subarctic regions of the country. My name's Maria Strack, and I'm Professor and Canada Research Chair at the University of Waterloo. And I've been working on peatland research, largely with a focus on carbon and greenhouse gas exchange for about the last 20 years. And more of my research is focused on the effects of disturbance on the ability of these wetlands to store carbon and the rates of their greenhouse gas exchange. And then thinking about ways and working with partners to develop mechanisms to mitigate those emissions, be that through conservation, reducing the disturbance of various types of impacts on the landscape, or through restoration and reclamation. And that's some of the work that I'll be sharing today. And more, I'm also working with partners in the government at provincial, territorial, and federal levels to think about how these management actions could then be considered nature-based solutions and help sort of in Canada's climate change strategy. And so I currently also have the pleasure of sitting on the advisory committee of Canada's Nature-Based Solutions Fund, which is being sort of managed by Environment Climate Change Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And I'm joined today by Kathy Pouliot, who will be sort of sharing the presentation, trading back and forth. And so Kathy is a research professional at the University of Laval in Quebec City. She has a master's degree in plant science from the University of Laval, in which she studied an innovative technique for restoring peatlands impacted by mineral roads. And we'll talk a bit about that today as well. Prior to her BSc in Natural and Managed Environments, she received a college degree in analytical chemistry and then worked as an analyst in environmental departments looking at water and soil analysis for 3 years. Since her master's graduation in 2017, she's worked as a research professional, first in a forest hydrology lab and now in the Peatland Ecology Research Group under the guidance of the renowned peatland ecologist, Dr. Lynn Rochefort, and we'll sort of be sharing a lot of the work that Kathy has been working on with Lynn in that group and that I'm also a part of today. So in that group, Kathy coordinates and participates in fieldwork planning and execution, data collection and data management of multiple concurrent restoration projects. So we're really pleased to sort of share some of the results of over 30 years of restoration research today. And we both have had the pleasure to work at many different peatland sites, and we're very grateful for the stewardship of these beautiful ecosystems that has been done and sort of by Indigenous communities across the country for millennia and continuing today. We're going to be sharing some research from many different sites across the territory that we now call Canada, but I'll acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the University of Waterloo, which is situated on the Haldimand Track, the traditional and unceded territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabeg, and Haudenosaunee people. And I feel very privileged to be able to live and work in the beautiful Grand River watershed. And with that, I will turn it over to Kathy, who will start the webinar today.
Hi, everyone. So we're here to talk about, just wait a second so I can see you. So we're here to talk about the return of ecological function following restoration. Just so we're on the same page, first of all, ecological restoration is the process of assisting the regeneration of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. For example, in our case, from natural peatland to this kind of post-extracted landscape. Never the goal is to restore the original ecosystem or to return the original condition, but we can aim at restoring the ecological function of those ecosystems. So we work on biotic and abiotic factors to jumpstart the recovery of the ecosystem, to put it on a trajectory where it can evolve, luckily without further intervention, to a fully functional ecosystem. So here you can see a non-restored site 20 years after the end of the peat extraction. You can easily see with the little to no biodiversity there that this ecosystem is not filling the function habitually attributed to peatlands. But with ecological restoration, we can fairly jumpstart the recovery of the ecosystem function. As an example, here we have a peatland that have been restored 20 years ago. The development of an efficient technique to restore degraded peatland was not achieved in one day or in one grant. Research for several years was given to understand better the biology of the sphagnum mosses, with attention to the condition leading to their survival in harsh environment and how to manipulate those tiny mosses with heavy machinery in order to restore it on a large-scale basis. So since 1991, constant funding from government programs and from the industry, the horticultural peat industry, led to this achievement. The peat industry reached to the research group because they wanted a science-based technique to restore peatland ecosystem at the end of their activities. And the fact that our scientific results are not filtered by any means by the industry, and that the scientific paper written over the years have been peer-reviewed, make this collaboration very healthy and legit. So all this journey led to the development of a strong, efficient technique to restore peatland, the moss layer transfer technique. I will go through the steps of the moss layer transfer technique, which I may call MLTT, it's short name, that is now widely used for restoration of peatland across Canada and across the world. So once all the planification is done, you can start the on-field restoration by preparing the surface. The reprofiling refreshed the surface. It improved the condition for the establishment of mosses by removing the crust made by solarization and by frost heaving, and it removed the existing vegetation if there is, and flatten the site. Then you will need to create some dams in secondary ditches. Also, a never-ending through can be used to close the ditches, which leads to a smoother transition from drier to wetter area. And that can improve also the amount of microhabitat and increase biodiversity. Then during site preparation, you might also need to add some berms. A berm is also called a dike. It's a low linear peat construction used to retain and control water runoff and to ensure the water distribution uniformly across the site. This technique creates a succession of terraces separated by dikes. They are perpendicular to the water flow direction. As a general rule, a perpendicular dike is needed for every 30 centimeter drop in elevation. And some situations call for checkboard pattern dikes, which creates small or less smaller cells that trap water. This is useful when a large surface needs to be restored on a flat site. The cells keep the peat, the plant fragment, and the mulch from being displaced by water and wind. Finally, we recommend to create an ecotone, which is the transition between the natural surrounding ecosystem and the restored area to ensure like the eco-hydrological connectivity. Truss and shape berms can also be very useful to control runoff from the connection with the surrounding ecosystem, like you can see around this checkboard pattern. Then plant harvesting. I present this as a second step, but it can actually be done before all the site preparation. Plant fragments are collected from what we call donor sites. Those are natural peatland, which we collect only the 5 to 10 top centimeter of living fragment and all the seed bank that is in there. Donor sites are often sectors to be opened for extraction. So as plant fragment cannot be stored for more than few seasons, or it loses its regenerative, the planification is very important to avoid wasting this living material. The ratio is 1:10 to 1:12, which means 1 hectare of harvested material is used to restore 10 to 12 hectares of degraded peatland. And when done correctly, it generally takes 5 to 10 years for the sphagnum layer of the donor site to regenerate. The next step simply involves applying a sufficient quantity of plant fragment in an even layer over the peat substrate in order to help the restoration to succeed. Fragments need to be sprayed in thin layer to ensure they can access water by capillarity and at the same time to access the sunlight. So here on the picture on the right, you can see on the right of the picture that a thin layer has been spread. And the plant fragments face very difficult conditions when they are spread on bare, dark peat surfaces. So exposure to heat, sun, wind will dry them out, decreasing their chances of surviving. A number of techniques were tested in the past to improve the establishment of plant materials, such as irrigating using sprinklers, pumping water in irrigation canals, living mulch, windbreaks, a lot of stuff. In almost all cases, the plant material dried out and died before being able to form a new plant cover. So the treatment giving the best result was using a protective cover like mulch. Fertilization is included in restoration measure because it significantly increases the chances of success by increasing the implementation of pioneer moss species, which act as nursing plant for sphagnum mosses. Polytrichum strictum that you see here are very evolved mosses. Even though they are not vascular, they have those primitive roots, some rhizoid, that stabilize the soil surface, prevent wind erosion and frost heaving, and favor the subsequent establishment of sphagnum colonies. Last step is to raise the water table by blocking the main ditches, by doing some peat dam or by filling them completely. It is important to accomplish the restoration steps within a short period of time and to do the final ditch blocking at the right time, generally after all the other work is complete, because blocking the drainage ditches will raise the water table and reduce ground support, and all this big machinery might sink into the peat. Monitoring is one of the aspects that is more neglected in restoration projects. To have long-term monitoring of restoration outcomes is very hard because of the short period covered by most of the budget. So on our side, because of the long-term collaboration we have with the industry and successive government grants, we have been able to build a long-term database of over 20 years. With researchers having all the specialities, over the year we've been taking measurement regarding biomass accumulation, vegetation diversity, fauna, carbon fluxes, just to name a few. And so what are the outcome of the moss layer transfer technique? So already we have almost 2,000 hectares have been restored with this technique from New Brunswick to Alberta. We were able to adjust the technique over the years by monitoring the restoration project the industry was continuously doing on their own, like out of our research project. They could do a lot of restoration because the method was developed with their collaboration regarding a lot of aspects like machinery and a lot of stuff. They did succeed to restore the extracted peatland because of those clear science-based steps. So once the solid foundation of the technique have been established, we could focus on the fine-tuning of the technique for more biodiversity and to optimize carbon accumulation function, for example. So the MLTT can be applied to any sphagnum-dominated peatland in the world. It is now being tested or has been applied on a large-scale basis in several countries around the world, like Denmark, Poland, Estonia, USA, Lithuania, Australia, a lot of places. And so furthermore, we have this huge database of almost 900 plots that we monitor regularly, which is used in a lot of studies and meta-analysis on ecosystem restoration. At this moment, a PhD student is working with this database to develop science-based criteria to assess the effectiveness of restoration action. I guess it will be very interesting for a regulator. And now, what about ecological function following restoration? Vegetation composition is a great indicator of the quality of the ecosystem and the return of functional ecosystem. In general, proper vegetation means proper hydrology and chemistry. So proper vegetation communities then makes habitat for fauna, biodiversity, and go on. Here you can see that as early as 10 years post-restoration, we reach a cover of shrubs, trees, and ericaceous shrubs similar to those of undisturbed peatland, of natural peatlands. For bryophyte cover, generally sites are reaching cover similar to natural peatland between 15 to 20 years post-restoration. You can see with the blue dots here at the beginning of the graph that the nursing effect of the polytrichum, the little moss I was talking about a bit earlier. So it commonly increases on the first 5 years, and then it's stabilized. And for the sphagnum, it is really after a few years when polytrichum did its job of stabilization that cover really increased significantly. So now we know that we have the cover, but do we have the species? A recent study showed that the MLTT has 82% vascular transfer rate, which is the proportion of species from donor sites successfully established in restored sites. This transfer rate stands among the highest transfer rates reported for restoration project, which is on average 68% for wetland restoration and 62% for dryland. For dry grassland project. So there are only 5 species that are really recalcitrant to the method because of their autoecology. Nevertheless, none of the recalcitrant species were absent from all the restored sites. And at the moment, we are currently looking at the transfer rate of mosses and all bryophytes. Regarding fauna biodiversity, one of our recent studies conclude that bird species assemblage of restored bug sites are converging toward those of natural sites, and that restoration provides novel habitat for regionally declining species. So that's a very good news. And for your information, we are also we have ongoing project about pollinators, arthropods, and herpetofauna. I'll pass on to Maria.
Thanks, Kathy. So I want to just spend a few minutes then talking about the return of carbon accumulating and peat accumulating function, as these are sort of some of the key functions that we associate with peatlands. But before I do that, I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about peatland carbon cycling so that we can sort of better understand what we may expect. So carbon is accumulated in peatlands as first coming from the atmosphere as carbon dioxide taken up by plants through photosynthesis. And some of that is immediately released back to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide through plant respiration, but about 50% of it stays within the plant biomass. And that itself is a carbon stock, but it will eventually die and be deposited as litter into the peat profile. And that's where we'll start to potentially accumulate that carbon. Now, the water table position is really critical for how much of that litter will actually start to form peat. Depending on how wet or dry the site is, we may have an unsaturated zone where oxygen will be more available. And that will then allow aerobic decomposition to occur, which is more efficient and can produce carbon dioxide. But if we have a wet site, or over time, a lot of that litter will be buried into the water-saturated peat, where because of slow diffusion rates in saturated soils, we have very little oxygen. And this then results in anaerobic decomposition, which is much less efficient. And so this actually leads to a really slow decomposition rate, which is really why we have the accumulation of peat, because that material that is deposited into the soil decomposes very slowly. So the water table position then will be important for how much of that litter actually survives and is stored in the peat profile. That anaerobic decomposition also produces small molecules that can be moved out of the system with water. And so most of that we would refer to as dissolved organic carbon. And we're interested in tracking that because it's important in understanding the overall carbon balance of the system, but also because it will largely be released as carbon dioxide in downstream ecosystems like lakes where that water may drain to. Anaerobic decomposition also results in the production of methane, and we're interested in tracking that again because it's an important part of the peatland carbon balance, but also because it's a greenhouse gas that has a greater global warming potential than carbon dioxide. And the water table position is again very important for the amount of methane that is produced, but also that makes it to the atmosphere. Because if that methane needs to move through an unsaturated peat layer where there's a lot of oxygen, most of it will be converted to carbon dioxide, and we would anticipate then very low methane emissions. So a dry site or a site where we've drained the system, we would expect would have high CO2 emissions, low rates of peat accumulation, but also low rates of methane emissions. Whereas a wetter site or a site that we've restored, we would expect would have low CO2 emissions or maybe even CO2 uptake, higher rates of peat accumulation then, but also slightly higher rates of methane emission. So next slide, Kathy. So if we put all that together, we know that natural undisturbed peatlands are long-term sinks of carbon, and contemporary flux rates are probably somewhere between about 30 and 80 grams of carbon per meter squared per year, varying depending on the peatland type and the conditions in the given year. And peatlands are also globally important sources of methane, accounting for about 5% of all global methane emissions, and important sources of downstream of dissolved organic carbon to downstream ecosystems. Next slide. So when we think about the return of ecosystem function, one of the key functions we're interested in is that peat accumulating and hence carbon accumulating function. And this had always been a long-term goal in the development of the moss layer transfer technique, that eventually hydrology and plant communities would return so that we would have carbon accumulation. And we can measure, sorry, can you just go back? We can measure that carbon accumulation by actually going out and measuring the peat that's there. On the left, you can see a peat core. We can measure its density, the depth of the peat that's there, and the amount of carbon in it to determine how much carbon is stored there. And we could date different layers in that peat to actually determine a peat accumulation rate. But measuring short-term peat accumulation, just sort of interannual variability or just sort of really recent accumulation is quite difficult because the total amount of peat that's there is quite big and the change is very small. So it's difficult to measure. So if we're interested in understanding rates of exchange, we generally measure contemporary rates of carbon exchange, either with chamber techniques in the center there, which are very good at helping us understand spatial variation, like how do different plant communities drive carbon accumulation, or how do different hydrologic conditions drive it. And this can be really useful when we're trying to make those sort of changes in a restoration technique to maximize carbon fluxes, for carbon uptake, for example. But this can be very time consuming. We usually need to be there in the field making those measurements. And so if we want to get sort of long-term and ecosystem scale records, we tend to use micrometeorological techniques, which are shown on the right, the most common one being eddy covariance. And this will give us an integrated estimate of the carbon exchange at sort of tens to hundreds of square meters scale. And we can get half-hourly estimates of that carbon exchange and also use that to get annual estimates. So I'll show you some results that we've collected over the last few years that use a variety of these techniques. So first, thinking about peat accumulation, Kathy talked about this incredible monitoring network that's been developed for monitoring vegetation recovery. And over about the last 5 years, we've also been collecting the accumulated material above the cutover layer. And you can see me there holding sort of 20 years of new peat that's accumulated. So if you look at the profile diagram on the right there, what we're collecting is really everything that's accumulated over that sort of cutover peat. So if you picture the brown as being that kind of cutover peat that was exposed during peat extraction, we collect all the moss and litter and all the living vegetation above it. And because we have sites that have been newly restored all the way through to sites that are 20 years of age, we can start to look across that monitoring network to get an estimate of how much material is accumulating over time. And this is then like an estimate of potential peat accumulation. And I've divided the data points here just based on some of the dominant plant outcomes that we see. And in particular, when the peat plant community is dominated by mosses in both of those green layers there, there's no significant difference in that accumulation rate. And we see that we might be accumulating anywhere between 85 and 90 grams of carbon per meter squared per year in that new peat layer. Even in the outcomes that are maybe not as desirable, where there's less of a plant cover, we're still accumulating new material above the cutover layer, but at a much lower rate. Next slide. But those estimates didn't account for the fact that the cutover peat underneath might still be decomposing and releasing more carbon. So to really understand whether the site is a source or a sink of carbon, we need to actually measure that. And so over the past few grants, we've been able to set up eddy covariance towers across several restored peatlands and compare that to sites that were not restored. And I'll walk you through the graph here, but just to start, the unrestored sites are sort of shown in the orange and reddish lines, the restored sites in the bluey colors, and then we compare that to a reference peatland, a reference bog, which had a long-term data record of close to 20 years of these measurements. And this is a cumulative carbon exchange from spring through summer, fall, and into the following winter and spring, so that when you look at the right-hand side, that will give you the cumulative annual total of the carbon exchange, where a positive value means the peatland is releasing that carbon out to the atmosphere, and a negative value means that the peatland is taking it up. So if you look first at the top orange line, where we have a site that has the extraction has just finished and no restoration activities have taken place, we basically have a dry peat area that's just decomposing and releasing carbon dioxide, so that by the end of the year, we've released about 450 grams of carbon per meter squared to the atmosphere. If we leave that site and do no activity in the two sort of reddish colored lines there, the total rate of emission declines slightly, but they still remain large sources of carbon to the atmosphere. As Kathy showed you the one picture, there's still large bare peat areas. There's very little plant community. The peat is still very dry, and so we have a lot of aerobic decomposition. And our measurements suggest that we were releasing sort of between 150 to 250 grams of carbon per meter squared per year, still after 15 years. If instead we restore the sites, so in the top sort of teal blue lines there, in the first few years, the plants are still establishing, and so we still have emissions of carbon to the atmosphere. But you can see that gradually over time, those blue lines sort of start to move towards the zero line. And by those 4-year sites, you can see periods where the lines are moving down towards that zero line, which indicates carbon uptake by the plants. Now, there's not yet enough carbon uptake to counteract the peat decomposition, but we're starting to release less carbon. And that lower blue line that we're pointing to right here, the 4-year lower blue line is a wetter site. So this also indicates that when we can get the peat wetter, we can actually sort of move towards that carbon uptake a little bit faster. When we then go to the sites after 15 years, we can now see, so the lowest blue lines, that pretty soon in the spring, in May or June, the plants turn on, they start taking up carbon, and they take up carbon throughout the summer, and the decomposition in the winter is not enough to offset that, so that we now have a carbon sink of about 100 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. which is on par or even greater than the data measured at the reference peatland. Next slide, please. Oh, and this has been published in 2018. It's some of the work of a PhD student, Kelly Nugent. So that tells a bit of a story about carbon dioxide exchange. But if we really want to understand the interaction of these systems with the atmosphere, we need to think about the radiative forcing or the warming or cooling effect of the variety of greenhouse gases that are being exchanged. And we can do that by running a model that considers the rates of those releases as well as the atmospheric lifetimes. And this is some more work that Kelly Nugent did and I'll walk you through a couple of the scenarios here. But the first thing to know is that when we're sort of below that 0 point, we have a negative radiative forcing, which means the peatland overall is cooling the atmosphere and mitigating climate change. Whereas if it's above that 0 point, we have a positive radiative forcing, we're warming the atmosphere and contributing additionally to climate change. Now, Kelly ran some scenarios that used both the data we've measured here in Canada, as well as some general numbers that are used for greenhouse gas accounting globally and that come from data compilations. So we're only going to focus on the solid lines today, which are the data coming from Canada. So the first scenario that Kelly looked at is shown in the depicted in the orange line, and this is when you do no restoration. And we're showing here the cumulative warming that the atmosphere sees over time. So in this scenario, peat extraction stopped in 1980. The site was just left with no restoration, and you can see that continual emission of carbon dioxide is continuing to warm the atmosphere more and more every year. The next scenario she considered is what actually happened at that peatland. They stopped peat extraction in 1980, and then they waited for 20 years before restoration. And that's shown in sort of the bluey purpley line. And so you see the first few years, it looks just like we did no restoration because we didn't. We then restore in the year 2000, and you see a little bump up as actually the restoration enhances carbon emissions for a few years. But then slowly, as we start to get that carbon sequestration, that line starts to move towards the 0 line, and eventually in about sort of 2150 crosses the 0 line and starts cooling the atmosphere. If instead we run a scenario with that lighter blue line where we restore the peatland immediately after we're done extraction, you can see there's still a little bit of warming in the first few decades, but then we start to have a cooling effect on the atmosphere after only about 40 years. And this really provided a really concrete take-home message that we could share with industry partners about the importance of restoring peatlands and keeping them wet as much as possible and restoring as soon as possible. Because from this analysis, we could learn that for every year you wait for restoration, you need 9 additional years before you'll cross this threshold back to cooling the atmosphere. Now, I will say that this analysis doesn't take into account carbon that would have been emitted from the peat that was extracted during extraction. And I'm happy to talk about that more during the Q&A if anyone has questions about that. This considers really just the peatland itself in a post-extracted state. Next slide. So just to sort of sum up what we've learned about peat and carbon accumulation from our research on the moss layer transfer technique is that we do see that we've been successful in our goal of returning carbon accumulating function, and that this happens within about 10 to 20 years after restoration. And just as a reminder, though, we know that natural peatlands are storing about 30 to 80 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. If we leave the sites unrestored, at least after 15 years, they're still releasing close to 200 grams of carbon per meter squared per year or more. And that our restored site was a sink of carbon dioxide of up to 100 grams of carbon, but even when we take into account losses of methane and dissolved organic carbon, was still storing between about 60 and 95 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. So we're quite pleased with the success that we've had in meeting our goals for the moss layer transfer technique, but we know there's also a lot of other types of disturbances that occur on peatlands that may require different types of restoration techniques. So I'll pass it back to Kathy to talk about some of the work we've been doing in those areas.
Thank you. So, as Maria said, apart from peatland extracted for horticultural purposes, we also tried a number of techniques regarding access road and wellpad decommissioning with other industries. In Alberta alone, there are over 400,000 wells in the province for the extraction of oil, and each of these wells require access road for their construction and exploitation, which result in a mosaic of thousands of kilometers of access road in peatlands. So we already tested a lot of ways to get rid of deactivated roads in peatlands, such as the complete removal with or without peat amendment, the partial removal, the establishment of fen communities over mineral, the burial of the road right on sites. So I just quickly show a few of those studies. So there was this road with 2 to 5 meter thick of clay amendment that was going through a sphagnum peatland in Alberta. As removing all this mineral matter and bring organic matter from another site to fill that pit will be very costly, we tested the partial removal of the clay to reach the mean elevation of the surrounding peatland, followed by the introduction of fen communities. So only 2 years post-reclamation, there was already a great cover of mosses and typical fen herbs. So in that case, like we're not bringing back, we're not getting like the same kind of peatland that was there previously, but we're bringing back an ecosystem that is functional, which was one of the goals of this project. The objectives that are aimed by each restoration project are the main drivers to set what kind of techniques you will use and the amount of resources that you will put in there. So in that case here, with the partial removal, further research will be needed to ensure hydrological connectivity between either side of the road. In other project, one of the goal was to limit the enrichment of the peatland by nutrients leach from the raw material, and also to reestablish that hydrological connectivity between both sides of the road. So to avoid taking all the mineral from a 3-kilometer road out of the peatland, we got the idea to bury it in place. So after the in situ inversion of the underlying peat and the mineral, we spread vegetation as we learned with the moss layer transfer technique. And after 2 years, vegetation tend to be similar to the surrounding peatland, and we did limit the enrichment of the peatland by the nutrients from the road, and we did reestablish the hydrological connectivity between the both sides of the road.
Thanks. So I'll just provide a few preliminary results that we have in terms of some of the return of ecosystem function following some of these techniques, acknowledging that sort of we're earlier on the stage, earlier on the path with some of these techniques. And so we don't sort of have necessarily those long-term records of how the ecosystems have progressed over time. But thinking about well pad restoration, earlier this year, I started compiling some of the results from a range of different sites where we have been collecting some plant community, hydrologic, and carbon flux data. And so here's just a summary of some of the results on the water table position, which help us to understand what techniques might be suitable for returning local hydrologic conditions. And this is focused on well pad decommissioning. So on the left-hand side, we have our reference ecosystems, which were sort of adjacent systems similar to what would have been disturbed. And the water table position, a negative number means below the surface, and a positive that there's flooding. So what we can see is that when we have complete removal of that mineral pad, we tend to get flooded conditions because the peat underneath has been compacted. And you can see an example of that in the photo on the top. And so that complete removal, or CR, really creates a wetland, but it doesn't necessarily create appropriate peatland hydrologic conditions. On the far right-hand side of the graph, we can see that if we leave the material completely in place and unrestored, we probably have slightly too dry conditions, as well as sort of a dense mineral soil that might be hard for peatland plants to establish on. But in the middle, we have a sort of a range of different techniques that seem to get us in the right water table range. So this suggests that several techniques might be viable. So complete removal with decompaction of the peat to try to bring it up to the elevation, and then partial removal of peat, partial removal where we expose peat, so that burial of the material that Kathy talked about, or partial removal where we leave that mineral soil, all can result in water tables similar to our reference ecosystems. But we also have examples where the water table still remains very deep. And this largely has to do with the decisions that we make during restoration. So if we decide to leave a lot more of that material on site, then we're going to get drier conditions. In this case, those were done to really test what was the best outcome, what was the best way to do the technique. But through that, we've learned a lot of things that hydrologic connectivity and kind of leveling the surface similar to the adjacent peatland is really key. Next slide. And one of the reasons that that's key is that those hydrologic conditions really drive the plants that establish and then the carbon exchange. And so this is some work of a PhD student, Micah Lemmer, who is working with Lynn Rochefort and myself on a range of these different techniques. And she measured carbon exchange only during the summer period. And if you look at the total carbon balance column there, anything positive again means the site was releasing carbon, and negative that it was able to take it up at least during the summer period. And here we can see the sort of implications of those hydrologic conditions. So in the red box, there are sites that were really quite dry, and that led to continued carbon emissions or really limited uptake in some cases. And then if the sites were really wet and flooded, so both complete removal, but also partial removal to a level that allowed a lot of flooding, we also had large continued carbon emissions because we didn't get a lot of plant establishment and because we had really large methane emissions. So this provides some important information for sort of guiding future restoration projects and understanding the importance of getting those hydrologic conditions correct. Next slide. So what we've learned so far about sort of these roads and well pad decommissioning is that there are advantages and limitations of all of the techniques, but several of them probably can lead to good peatland outcomes. And that actually provides quite a bit of flexibility then that allows operators to think about the context that they're in, as well as their restoration goals. So that, you know, if we're aiming at biodiversity versus if we're aiming at maybe water retention or carbon accumulation, we may choose different techniques. Maybe we also have limitations in terms of we don't have anywhere to put that mineral fill, then burying it in place may be the best technique for that situation. But we have learned that in all cases, getting that hydrologic connection and having kind of water saturated but not flooded conditions tend to lead to the best ecosystem outcomes, at least so far. Next slide. And so our key messages from sort of what we've learned so far in thinking about ecological restoration of peatlands is that many peatland ecosystems can be returned in terms of bringing back peatland plant communities, bringing back some of the faunal diversity, carbon and peat accumulation, and actually on relatively short timescales. So it seems that we can get a lot of these functions back within about 10 to 20 years. But that being said, the sooner we can restore these peatlands, the better, so that we can first of all protect the remaining peat that's there and keep it wet from a carbon point of view, but also so that we can get back these ecosystem functions as soon as possible. We've also really learned the benefits of collaborative research. First of all, in this program, it's allowed this long-term monitoring and the creation of a data set that really is world-class. I don't think there's really any other data monitoring systems post-restoration that have such a long-term record across so many sites. It's also allowed adaptive management, and as Kathy talked about, sort of continually improving the method. And working with industry partners has allowed us to ensure that the method is developed in a way in which it will actually be applied. So using machinery that's actually available and that makes it applicable at large scales at a reasonable cost. We also collaborate, having collaboration and input with government partners has also been really key. And some of the results of this work has then changed peatland management in provinces. And the results of this work are feeding into regulations on peatland management. And so I think that open conversation is also really important. And so we look forward to sort of continuing collaboration so that we can understand how to apply what we've learned so far to new environments, new peatland types, and new types of challenges and disturbances. So with that, I think we have our contact information, but we also have some time for questions. So feel free to put those in the chat, raise your hand if you want to ask it in person. And I think we still have about 15 minutes left for anyone that does have any questions.